They mocked her cardigan and laughed at her shoes, never knowing the truth. By the end of the night, the woman they dismissed would own the room and their future. Rain streaked down the windows of the restaurant, blurring the city lights into watery smears of gold and red. The kind of night where most people rushed home, but inside the dining room, everything gleamed as if the world outside did not exist. Velvet chairs and polished silver, quiet music drifting through the air, and the scent of steak heavy with butter, garlic, and smoke. A promise of luxury meant for those who could afford to belong. She did not look like she belonged, not in the cardigan that hung too loose on her shoulders, not in the shoes with faded soles, not at the wobbly table by the kitchen doors, where the noise of pots and the sharp voices of chefs bled through every time the door swung open, a place reserved for late walk-ins, tourists, or anyone the hostess did not care to impress. She settled in without protest, smoothing the folded paper napkin on her lap, asking only for a glass of water, her voice even polite, without the desperation the staff expected. The whispers began as soon as she sat, carried on the low current of laughter from the bar and murmurs between servers balancing trays of wine. They called her broke, said she must be a charity case, clinging to the illusion of fine dining, maybe hoping to stretch a single appetizer into a night's escape. Some pitied her, others sneered, but she heard it all and let it pass like wind across stone. Her eyes moved over the room not with hunger but with a kind of quiet study, catching the flicker of candlelight in the glasses, the way the manager's smile widened for men in tailored suits, the way the waitresses stiffened when he passed, the hierarchy of attention laid bare like lines in a ledger. A busser dropped a fork near her table and flushed red, but she bent down to hand it back with a smile. No scolding, no impatience, only a word of thanks that made the boy straighten his back with relief. She lifted her water when it came and sipped slowly as if it were wine, not caring about the stares from the couple at the next table, their pearls and cufflinks reflecting the light. As they looked at her cardigan with open disapproval, she held her silence with grace, as though she carried a secret they could not touch. The kitchen door slammed again, and the smell of charred meat and onions washed over her. But she did not flinch. She sat steady, her hands folded on the table, her gaze drifting now and then to the rain outside, as if measuring time against the storm. The staff judged her by fabric and posture, by the worn threads of her clothes, but what they could not see was the steel in her calm, the patience in her breath, the choice to meet every sneer with composure. To them she was invisible, the worst table in the house filled by someone who did not matter. But to her it was simply a seat, a place to watch, a place to wait. She asked for nothing more, not bread, not wine, just water, and she smiled when it came, as if even that was enough. The doors of the restaurant opened with a rush of warm air and perfume as Cole Harrington stepped inside, his shoulders straight, and his smile already in place. The kind of smile that had closed deals worth billions and convinced entire markets to bend his way. A smile that was both charm and weapon. At 39, he had the energy of a man who thrived on motion, a venture titan whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the globe. And tonight, he was not alone. He was flanked by an entourage that glittered almost as much as the lights above the bar. Men in custom suits and women in silk dresses walked behind him, their laughter pitched just loud enough to be heard, a signal that their night would be written in excess and indulgence. Cole's eyes swept the room like a surveyor, noting who looked up, who whispered, who pretended not to notice, but still stared from the corner of their eye. Attention was currency, and he collected it easily, not through effort, but through presence. The hostess, a young woman with red lipstick and nerves hidden under professional polish, greeted him with a brightness that bordered on relief, as though the arrival of someone like him validated the worth of her post. She asked if he had a reservation, though she already knew the answer, and Cole only grinned wider, brushing aside the question with a story about a board meeting that had run late, a story delivered with a wink and a casual shrug, as if his lateness was not an inconvenience but a privilege. She laughed when he finished, laughed harder than the joke deserved, and he tipped her not with cash but with the story itself, the kind of attention she would replay to friends later as proof that she mattered in his orbit. He was led to the center of the dining room, where the chandeliers burned golden and the tables were full of power and polish, and Cole moved like a man who owned not just his chair, but the air around it. He adjusted his cufflinks with a practiced ease, leaned back, and without glancing at the menu, ordered the Emperor's Cut, the most expensive steak on offer. Paired with a vintage wine that cost more than most guests' rent, he spoke the words as if reciting them from memory, not as a choice, but as an expectation. His entourage followed his lead, ordering indulgence without hesitation, their voices loud, their confidence contagious, their laughter rising in sharp bursts that cut across the softer hum of the other tables. Cole liked that. He liked the ripple of discomfort his presence created. He liked knowing that the restaurant would remember his table long after the plates were cleared, not for the food, but for the spectacle. To him, dining was never about hunger, it was about performance, about reminding the world that he lived at a scale beyond ordinary reach. As he raised his glass in a casual toast, the camera, ready grin never faltered, but in the corner of the room, a woman in a thrift store cardigan lifted her water and watched, her eyes calm, her presence unnoticed. And though he could not see it yet, the night had already placed them on a collision course. She moved through the dining room with the calm rhythm of someone who had learned how to be invisible without ever fading. Her cardigan soft at the elbows and her shoes worn smooth, yet her steps carried a quiet steadiness that no uniform could disguise. She noticed everything. The frayed hems on the servers who smiled too wide, the exhausted eyes of the cooks visible each time the swinging kitchen doors burst open, the manager drifting from table to table with a grin that never reached his eyes, his charm too practiced, too oily, his words polished but empty. She carried a small notepad she hardly needed, her memory sharper than anyone guessed, and when she approached Cole Harrington's table, she did not hesitate. She did not shrink from the gold cufflinks or the expensive laughter. She greeted him with the same tone she used for the man at the bar, drinking alone. A voice that was even, respectful, and strangely steady. "Good evening, sir," she said. And though the word was polite, it was not deferential. It was equal, the syllable landing with a calm weight that cut through the noise around them. Cole glanced up, expecting to see the usual glimmer of awe or fear that followed him, but what he saw was different. Her eyes were intelligent and unreadable, her smile faint but genuine, the kind of expression that was not performed but chosen. She poured his wine without trembling, set the glass before him with precision, and when she asked if he needed anything further, it did not sound like habit. It sounded like she actually wanted to know. The entourage around him smirked. One whispered something about her cardigan, another snickered at the shoes that had lost their shine years ago. Yet she did not flinch. She stood steady, listening, as if the insult had dissolved before reaching her ears. Cole noticed it, though he pretended not to, and for a flicker of a second, he wondered why her silence carried more weight than their laughter. She asked about his steak preference, and recorded it with the faintest nod, moving as smoothly as a dancer through the narrow space, her posture straight, her presence unbothered by the arrogance that rolled from his table like heat from a furnace. When she returned with bread and butter, she set it down gently, her fingers brushing the edge of the plate with care. Then she looked directly at him, not at his clothes, not at the companions who tried to shine brighter than the chandeliers, but at him, as though seeing past the public mask he wore, the mask that sold companies and captured headlines. Her gaze held for a second too long, then moved on, without apology. Cole found himself unsettled, though he would never admit it. Unsettled by a waitress in a faded cardigan who treated him not as a millionaire to impress, nor a man to fear, but simply as another human being sitting at a table waiting for his meal. And in that simple act, She shifted the balance of the night without saying more than a handful of words. The jokes began as soon as she walked away, tossed like coins on porcelain plates, careless and sharp. One of Cole's friends leaned back in his chair and nodded at her shoes, cracked leather dull under the light, whispering that they looked borrowed from a thrift bin. Another said she had the kind of energy you only get from community college nights, grinding away at textbooks and odd jobs, a life far from the gleam of tailored suits and corner offices. The laughter rippled around the table, loud enough to be heard. Designed that way, a performance of power at the expense of someone they believed powerless. She returned with a tray balanced in her hands, her face as calm as the still surface of a lake, her cardigan sleeve brushing against the table as she set down the bread. She heard every word, every barb, but she did not let it touch her, not in the way they hoped. Her posture did not fold, her smile did not tremble. She simply stood steady, her presence quiet but undeniable. She asked if they were ready for their starters, her voice carrying no trace of hurt, no quiver, only warmth, as though the room were kind, as though the laughter had been friendly and not cruel. She pointed gently to the seasonal special, roasted squash with sage and brown butter, speaking of it not like a pitch, but like an invitation, her words soft, almost soothing, a reminder that food could be comfort rather than spectacle. Cole's friends exchanged glances, smirks, lingering. Yet she did not waver. She described the dish with the same care she would offer to anyone, not selling, not pleading, just offering, as though generosity was her shield. One of the women at the table asked her pointedly if the dish was cheap, the word laced with venom, but the waitress only smiled faintly and said it was priced for quality, not for show. Then she gathered the menus and stepped back, her expression unreadable, her eyes calm in a way that unsettled those who had just mocked her. They wanted flinching, they wanted proof that their laughter mattered, but she denied them that satisfaction, her composure stronger than their cruelty. Cole watched in silence, his grin faltering for the first time that night. Though he laughed when they did, his eyes followed her as she walked to the next table, her shoes soundless on the polished floor, her cardigan catching the warm glow of the chandeliers. She looked fragile in her clothes, yet carried herself like someone who could not be broken, not by whispers, not by jokes spoken loudly enough to wound. She absorbed the cruelty as though it were smoke that passed around her without staining, and in her refusal to bend, she revealed a strength that none of them recognized. The laughter faded into shallow chatter, but her presence lingered, a quiet defiance stronger than mockery, a dignity that turned the sharp edges of their words into nothing more than noise on porcelain. The back hallway smelled of bleach and old grease, a narrow stretch of concrete that most diners would never see, lined with crates stacked unevenly and a single buzzing light overhead. She leaned against the wall for a moment, letting the noise of the dining room fade, then slipped a small device from her apron pocket. It looked like a regular server pad, smudged and scratched like the rest, but when she tapped the screen, it unlocked to something more, rows of numbers and charts glowing faintly in the dim corridor. Her eyes moved quickly over the data, trained and sharp, the same way she once moved through accounting textbooks before her life was pulled in another direction. She knew what she was looking at: food cost variances that did not make sense, percentages that climbed higher than they should, patterns of spoilage that never matched the volume of orders reported, tiny leaks at first, but now widening into a drain that bled the restaurant with precision. She scrolled through the files, her breath steady, each page confirming what she already suspected: someone was siphoning money, not clumsily, but with intent, with planning. Invoices that pointed to deliveries from a supplier no one in the industry seemed to know, names that did not appear in official directories, brands that had no footprint outside of these orders. Every path curved back to one place: the manager's private channel, his pet supplier, whose name surfaced again and again like a stain that could not be scrubbed out. She paused, the pad balanced carefully in her hand, and thought of the staff who stretched themselves thin night after night, their wages small, their shoes worn, their energy burned down to embers, all while the numbers told a story of theft carried out in the shadows, and the man who smiled too wide at wealthy diners was at the center of it. Her face gave nothing away when she tucked the tablet back into her apron. No flicker of anger, no flash of fear, just the same calm mask she wore when she carried plates and poured water, the same faint smile that concealed the storm inside. She had grown used to hiding, to folding her truths into silence. But the numbers whispered to her in ways no one else noticed. They told her the restaurant was being gutted from within. Its profits funneled away through a pipeline disguised as legitimate trade. She smoothed her cardigan as if brushing away dust, then stepped back toward the glow of the dining room. The pad locked again into its simple disguise, a server's tool, nothing more. She passed other staff in the hall, offering them the same quiet nod, the same softness that made them feel seen, even when she carried her own burdens. None of them would guess that behind her smile she had already mapped the flow of corruption, that she could trace the leak straight to the man who barked orders and polished his tie with greasy fingers, the man who thought no one beneath him could ever understand what he was doing. But she did. She understood too well, and though her expression betrayed nothing, a decision was beginning to take shape deep inside her. She carried the glass with steady hands, the wine catching the light as she crossed the floor, her cardigan brushing softly against her apron, her steps unhurried, though the table she approached demanded speed and attention. Cole Harrington looked up as she arrived, his smile fixed, his entourage loud, with stories about profits and acquisitions. But her eyes stayed on him alone, calm, curious, and unflinching. She set the glass gently before him, the stem turning between her fingers with practiced care, and for a moment, her reflection flickered in the ruby surface, faint and steady. She asked if he would like anything else, her voice low but clear, and before she could step away, she tilted her head slightly and asked a question that did not belong in the script of service, a question that hovered just outside the expected exchange. "What do you think gives something its value?" she asked, her tone polite, her face unreadable, as though the question were nothing more than casual interest, though it carried a weight she did not disguise. The table quieted for a beat, surprised. Then laughter bubbled from one of his companions. But Cole leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks, ready to perform, because questions about value were the kind of stage he believed was his alone. He launched into his answer with practiced ease, words sliding together in a polished rhythm he had delivered countless times before. He spoke of disruption, of markets bending to innovation, of scale that turned ideas into empires, his hands moving in smooth gestures, his voice rich with confidence, a monologue born from interviews and boardrooms, a performance so well memorized it no longer needed thought. She listened, her face calm, her eyes steady, her stillness so complete it almost unsettled him, but she did not interrupt. She let him finish every phrase, every polished line, until his answer wound down, and the table nodded with admiration. Proud to sit with a man who could speak with such ease, proud to bask in the cadence of certainty. She did not smile when he finished. She only gave a small nod, her eyes dimming by a degree so subtle, only he caught it, as though she had asked not for the sound of his answer but for the truth within it, and found the truth missing. She thanked him softly, her tone unchanged, then stepped back from the table, her presence as quiet as it had been when she approached. But the air around him shifted slightly, a sense that her question had been more than idle curiosity, more than the kind of chatter expected from a waitress in a faded cardigan. Cole raised the glass and drank, but the taste lingered less than the flicker in her eyes, that brief glint of disappointment that cut through his armor of charm. He could not name why it unsettled him, only that for a moment he felt smaller beneath her steady gaze, as though her question had measured him in a way he was not used to being measured, not by price, not by numbers, but by something deeper, something he had not yet answered. The walk, indoor closed behind her, with a metallic thud, and the cool air wrapped around her arms as she stacked containers on the shelf, her breath clouding faintly in the chilled space, the rhythm of her work steady, until the shadow stretched across the doorway, blocking the strip of warm light from the kitchen. Victor Lowell stood there, the manager with the sharp suit and the knot on his tie always perfectly centered, his smile tight and his eyes cold. He motioned for her to step out, and when she did, the scent of his cologne replaced the crisp air, heavy and cloying in the narrow hallway. He leaned too close, his voice pitched low so no one else could hear, the kind of tone meant to unsettle rather than instruct. His words dripping with the smugness of someone who believed control was permanent. "Cardigan girls don't get promoted," he said, his gaze sliding over her faded sweater like it was evidence against her, his mouth twisting into a grin that never reached his eyes. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness, as if the small gesture confirmed his authority. Then he went on, reminding her that appearances mattered in a place like this, that diners didn't trust servers who looked like they had borrowed their clothes from Lost and Found, that she should be grateful to have a job at all. She kept her hands folded against her apron, her face calm though his words pressed hard. She let him talk, her silence a shield he mistook for weakness, and his smirk deepened because he thought he was winning. Then he added the part that tightened like a wire around her, a threat spoken so casually it could be mistaken for advice. He reminded her of the hours he controlled, the shifts he could take away, the recommendations he could deny, the invisible blacklist he claimed to keep of names that never worked in fine dining again. He told her she was one mistake away from being cut loose, one slip from losing everything, and he let the pause stretch long enough for the weight of his words to settle. She met his eyes for a fraction of a second, unflinching, though her heart pressed hard against her ribs, then looked away before he could see the spark of defiance beneath her calm. Victor stepped back at last, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve, his grin polished into something others might call professional. Then he turned as though nothing had been said, his shoes clicking on the tile as he returned to the glow of the dining room, ready to charm the wealthy with his smile and his lies. She lingered in the hallway, her cardigan still soft against her arms, her pulse steadying as she reached for the next tray, her silence unbroken but her resolve stronger. She knew the crooked ledger he guarded was bleeding this place dry, and no threat, however smooth, could erase the numbers she had already seen. The dining room was full, the low hum of polished laughter rolling beneath the soft music, glasses clinking like notes in a measured song, and servers moved quickly between tables, balancing trays of wine and silver dishes, the machine of service running smooth until one sharp sound cut through it all. A busser no older than 17 slipped on a patch of water near the bar, his arms flailing as the heavy plate slid from his grip, crashing against the floor in a shatter so loud it froze every conversation mid-sentence, fragments scattering across the polished wood like broken mirrors, silence spreading as diners turned their heads, their eyes sharp and waiting for someone to pay. The boy stood frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling at his sides, his apron spotted with sauce, his eyes wide with the terror of knowing what would come next. Before he could bend to pick up the shards, before he could stammer an apology, Victor Lowell was already moving across the room, his tie perfect, his expression carved into a mask of outrage. He saw weakness. He saw a chance to remind everyone who held the leash, and his voice rose sharp and hard, ready to lash the boy in front of the watching crowd. But the waitress in the cardigan was already there, kneeling on the floor, her hands steady as she began to gather the shards one by one, sliding them into the buspan with calm precision, her sweater brushing the ground, her hair slipping loose from its tie. She did not rush. She did not flinch under the eyes watching. She only worked with quiet dignity, as if cleaning broken glass was the most natural thing in the world. She looked up at the boy and gave him a small nod, a silent message that he was safe, that he was not alone in his mistake, and the tension in his shoulders eased, though his eyes still burned with fear. When Victor reached them, his mouth already open to deliver the rebuke. She spoke first, her voice even, steady, carrying just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "That was my fault," she said, as though the words were simple truth. "I should have cleared the path earlier. I didn't see the spill." Her tone carried no plea, no hesitation, just calm acceptance. And the diners nearest them shifted, their judgment turning not on the boy but on Victor, their eyes narrowing, waiting to see if he would punish someone who had just admitted blame with such quiet grace. Victor hesitated, the sharpness in his voice caught in his throat, his smirk faltering under the weight of watching eyes. He forced a tight smile instead, muttered something about being more careful, and turned back toward the bar, his control slipping for a moment. The waitress finished gathering the shards, rose smoothly, and carried the buspan away, her expression calm, her voice still steady, leaving behind the boy who now stood straighter, saved by her shield, and leaving behind a room that had seen a glimpse of dignity stronger than anger, a reminder that kindness could silence cruelty even in the harshest light. Cole leaned back in his chair, the stem of his glass turning idly between his fingers, as the dining room settled again, conversation resuming after the sudden break. Though his attention did not drift with it, his eyes stayed on the girl in the cardigan, the one who had knelt on the floor without hesitation, who had taken the sting meant for the boy and absorbed it with calm strength. He had watched men in boardrooms fold under far less pressure. He had seen executives crumble when their numbers were questioned. Yet this woman, dressed in clothes the others mocked, had stood firm without raising her voice, her composure steady as stone. Something about that unsettled him, though he disguised it with the easy grin he wore like armor. She passed his table again, balancing a tray with effortless grace, her eyes sweeping the room, always watchful, always present, and he caught the faintest flicker of defiance beneath her calm, a light he could not quite name, but recognized instinctively as power, the kind hidden in people who refuse to be broken. Cole tapped a folded bill against the table, feeling the paper flecks beneath his thumb, his entourage laughing at another story, their noise a cover for his thoughts. He was used to testing people, pushing until they showed the cracks beneath the surface, and he wanted to see if she would crack. When she returned with water, setting it before him with the same steady hands as before, he slid the bill across the linen, the green edge catching the candlelight. $100 note for a simple glass, his smirk deliberate, his voice smooth as he said, "For your trouble." His friends chuckled, amused by the display, expecting gratitude, maybe a blush, the usual response he received when he handed out money like favors, because to most people that kind of gesture was irresistible, an easy win. But she only looked at the bill for a moment, her expression unreadable, her eyes lifting back to his with calm steadiness, and then she set the glass down without taking it, her voice quiet but even. "No trouble at all," she said, sliding the bill gently back toward him with the edge of the tray, her movement polite, unflustered, final. The laughter at his table faltered, replaced by a thin silence as his friends exchanged glances, surprised that she had refused what most would have taken in an instant. Cole held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, the smirk still on his lips, but something sharper flickering in his eyes, because her refusal was not about pride, it was about something deeper, a boundary she would not let him cross, a line drawn without words. She walked away with the same calm pace as before, her cardigan brushing softly at her sides, and Cole felt a spark of something he did not often feel, the sensation of being measured, tested, and found wanting. It was not the money that mattered, it was the dignity she guarded, and he realized, with a quiet jolt, that she had passed a test he had not even known he was taking. The restaurant emptied slowly, the glow of chandeliers dimming as the last guests drifted out into the wet night, their laughter fading down the street, the air inside heavy with the scent of meat and wine and smoke. Staff moved quickly to reset the room, folding napkins into neat triangles, polishing glasses until they gleamed. the rhythm of closing time familiar and practiced. She worked among them with the same calm precision she always carried, stacking plates, wiping down a table, nodding when spoken to, nothing in her movements revealing that she was waiting, counting the minutes until the doors locked. When the last busser slipped out, when the lights over the bar were switched off, she pulled her cardigan tighter, her posture shifting, her focus narrowing. She changed her shoes first, trading the worn black pair she used in the dining room for dark flats tucked at the bottom of her bag, quiet soles that would not echo against tile. She moved into the back hallway, the one lined with crates and mop buckets, and her hand brushed the wall as if she were reading it, tracing angles, measuring steps. To anyone else it was just a corridor, but to her it was a blueprint. Every hinge, every camera, every blind spot memorized during nights when she seemed merely busy. She pulled the small tablet from her apron again, its glow faint in the shadows, snapping quick photographs of the loading area, the signature on delivery slips, the labels on boxes stacked haphazardly near the walk. Labels she knew belonged to a shell distributor that did not exist in any legitimate record. She crouched low, her fingers brushing over one crate stamped with the wrong insignia, the paperwork attached written in Victor Lowell's sharp hand. She snapped another photograph, then moved swiftly to the next, her breath even, her pulse steady, though her ears strained for the sound of footsteps. The kitchen was silent, the hum of refrigeration, the only noise, the world outside still dripping from rain. She worked quickly but methodically, every detail captured, the dates, the quantities, the supplier name repeated like a signature of fraud across every sheet. When she was finished, she stepped back, the evidence locked in digital frames, her reflection caught in the dark window of the back door, a woman in a cardigan and flats with eyes too calm for someone supposed to be powerless. She pulled out a phone, not her regular one but an older device with no name attached. The screen cracked in one corner, and she opened a secure thread with hands that did not tremble. She typed a single word, concise and final, then pressed send. Confirmed. The message vanished into the encrypted channel, traveling to someone who would know what it meant, someone who would act. She slipped the phone back into her bag, smoothed her cardigan, and walked once more through the empty dining room, her steps soundless, her face composed, as though she had only been closing down the night. Morning broke clear and sharp. The storm washed from the streets, the city's glass towers burning gold in the first light, and inside one of those towers, a private elevator rose without pause, smooth and silent, carrying a single figure upward past floors, filled with assistants and analysts who never saw her arrive. She stepped out into a quiet lobby where the carpet hushed her steps, and a receptionist rose automatically, offering a greeting that carried not the stiffness reserved for strangers, but the deference given to someone known, someone important. She moved past without fuss, her cardigan soft against her shoulders, her flats whispering against the floor, and pushed open the doors to the conference room where steel and glass caught the morning light like a blade. The table stretched long, gleaming, surrounded by men and women in dark suits, their papers stacked neatly, their screens lit with graphs and figures, their voices low as they reviewed the morning agenda. The room carried the heavy silence of power, broken only when she entered, and for a moment they hesitated, surprised perhaps at the cardigan and the simple clothes, the contrast against their pressed collars and silk ties. She moved without hurry, without apology, sliding the chair at the head of the table back, hanging her cardigan over it like it belonged there, which it did, then placing a slim laptop before her with a quiet click. The sound was small, yet it carried, and when she lifted her eyes to the room, the effect was immediate. Chairs shifted, backs straightened, a murmur stilled, and then, as if on cue, the entire room stood. 32 years old, sharp-eyed and calm, Elena Vale did not need to raise her voice to command them. She had walked into this space before, countless times, But the moment never lost its edge. The power of presence pressed into silence. Last night she had been a waitress in a cardigan, carrying plates and water, absorbing cruelty with grace, and no one in that dining room had known they were mocking the very woman who owned the company, who signed the contracts that kept their wages flowing, who could dismantle the building stone by stone if she chose. She opened her laptop, the screen lighting her face, and the first words she spoke were measured, simple, precise. She asked for the overnight reports, for variance notes, for updates on supply discrepancies, her voice calm, carrying no strain, yet every person at the table leaned in as though each word were a verdict. She moved through the details with the same quiet precision she had shown in the dining room, her questions cutting clean through numbers, her gaze sharp when an answer faltered. No one dared to underestimate her. Not here. Not in this glass chamber, where the city skyline stood behind her like a crown. The cardigan draped on the chair looked ordinary, threadbare even, but it hung there like a symbol, a reminder that power did not always dress in silk or shine in cufflinks. Sometimes it wore soft sleeves and steady eyes. Sometimes it walked unseen among the people it led, gathering truths no report could show. Elena Vale, waitress by night and CEO by morning, carried both roles with the same quiet strength. And as the board resumed their seats, the room knew with certainty that she was not to be questioned, not in her authority, not in her vision. Cole strode into the lobby with the confidence of a man used to being announced, his steps quick but unhurried, his suit perfectly cut, his watch gleaming under the lights, the picture of a venture titan ready to win another deal. His team trailed behind, carrying binders and sleek cases, faces already rehearsed into bright masks of certainty, their presentation polished down to every word. He barely glanced at the receptionist who directed him toward the top floor, his mind already on the performance to come, the pitch he believed would secure him another eight-figure expansion, another feather in his crown of disruption. The elevator doors slid open, and he entered the steel and glass conference room as though it were a stage built for him, his grin wide, his posture easy, his voice warm, as he greeted the board with the same charm that had carried him through hundreds of such rooms. He placed his laptop at the far end of the table, clicking it open with practiced flair, the screen casting graphs in clean blues and reds, projections that showed sharp upward arrows, the promise of growth built on ghost kitchens, a model he had been pushing across cities with calculated aggression. He spoke of reduced overhead, of scalable footprints, of the way smaller kitchens could multiply brand reach without the heavy cost of prime real estate. His words flowing smooth, his hands sketching arcs in the air, each phrase polished into confidence. The board nodded, some scribbling notes, others leaning back, impressed by the rhythm of his certainty. And Cole fed on their approval, his smile sharpening with every agreeing glance. At the head of the table, Elena Vale sat still, her cardigan folded neatly on the back of her chair, her eyes on him, calm and unblinking. But Cole did not notice, not truly. He saw her only as another executive, one among many, another figure to persuade with the force of his graphs and his charm. He never recognized the woman who had poured his wine the night before, who had refused his $100 bill with dignity, who had absorbed his friend's laughter without a tremor. To him, she was just another audience, another name he had not cared to learn. He leaned harder on his pitch, speaking of market share and speed, of disruption as if it were gospel, of numbers that scaled cleanly on his slides, and when he smiled it was the same smile he used on investors, confident, camera, ready, untouchable. He told a story about a competitor he had outmaneuvered, his laugh carrying the edge of triumph, the kind meant to dazzle. His team clicked through slides behind him, data flowing across the screen in a stream of inevitability, the vision laid out in lines and charts, unstoppable if only they would follow him. What he did not see was the faint dimming in Elena's eyes, the small tightening at the corners of her mouth, the weight of someone measuring his words not for shine, but for substance. He did not see that his polished rhythm sounded rehearsed, that his story carried no humility, that his pitch was all noise and no soul. He spoke, and the board listened. But in the quiet space between his words, it was Elena's silence that filled the room, her calm presence stronger than his practiced charm, though he had yet to understand it. The room was quiet after the last slide clicked away, the blue glow fading from the screen as Cole straightened his cuffs, his grin still fixed in place, expecting the nods and eager questions that usually followed his performances. Instead, Elena Vale leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the polished table, her voice calm, measured, almost soft, yet carrying a weight that made the room still. She thanked him for the presentation, her tone polite, but then asked not about projections or scaling, not about margins or market dominance, but about people, about labor safeguards for the kitchen crews who would be running these ghost facilities late into the night, about how their wages would be protected when costs were cut, about what systems he had in place to ensure the food was safe, the supply chain transparent, the ethics as solid as the numbers on his slides. Cole's grin flickered, but did not break. He was used to such questions, though never asked with such precision, and he reached for the buzzwords he had polished in countless interviews, words like sustainability and optimization, phrases about aligning incentives and streamlined compliance. His tone still confident, his voice smooth, but the answers rang hollow in the glass room. Elena did not interrupt. She only watched, her eyes steady, her silence pulling the room tighter with every word he spoke, as though the emptiness in his responses became more visible the longer he tried to hide it behind charm. When she asked again, more directly this time, about supplier accountability and the name of the distributor he used in a recent rollout, his voice caught for half a second before smoothing over, and then he mentioned Victor Lowell, casually, as though it were a detail of no consequence. The name slid across the table like a stone dropped in water, ripples of unease spreading among those who understood more than Cole did. Elena's eyes flicked once to her CFO at her right, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a stack of papers always at hand, and without a word he reached into his folder, pulling free a thin file bound neatly with a clip. He slid it across the table, the sound of paper against glass sharp in the stillness, and when it came to rest before Cole, the room seemed to lean toward it, waiting. Elena did not touch it, she only spoke, her voice calm as ever, reminding him that numbers alone could not define value, that dignity came first, that a company built only on margins would collapse under the weight of its own neglect. Cole glanced down at the folder, his grin stiffening, and though he had faced investors worth billions, there was something in the quiet authority of her gaze that unsettled him more than any hostile boardroom had ever managed. The folder sat between them like a verdict, silent, undeniable, and for the first time in years, Cole Harrington felt the ground shift beneath his polished shoes. Cole hesitated before touching the folder, his fingers hovering above the clipped edge as though the paper might burn. Then he drew it closer and opened it, the neat pages unfolding into a story he had not expected. Invoices lay stacked in chronological order, each stamped with dates that matched delivery logs, each bearing the name of a supplier he did not recognize, yet the quantities and costs were carefully aligned. Too carefully, the numbers singing of design rather than chance. Next came the timestamps, photographs of crates arriving at back doors long after guests had gone home, each image marked with exact minutes, each driver moving quickly under shadows, one face appearing more than once, a face later identified as belonging to Victor Lowell's cousin, a man with no official ties to the company, but a clear path in and out of its kitchens. The stills sharpened the truth further, showing crates that entered, stamped with premium labels, yet left half empty, substitutions made in the dark, cheaper products swapped for quality, profits siphoned not only from margins but from safety itself. The ledger lines matched the photographs, roots traced back through a shell company with no legitimate standing, a paper facade built to bleed the restaurant dry while serving guests food that no longer matched the promise printed on the menu. Cole's entourage shifted in their seats, their confidence draining as the pattern became undeniable, and even his polished smile faltered as he flipped page after page. Elena did not move, her eyes fixed on him, her cardigan draped over the chair behind her like a reminder of another night. Another room, where she had watched the same story unfold in real time. She said nothing, letting the silence press down, letting the evidence speak for itself, her calm presence heavier than any accusation. Cole swallowed, his throat dry, and for the first time he felt the performance slip, his usual arsenal of charm and rhetoric useless against the cold weight of photographs and numbers. He looked at her across the table, not at her clothes, not at the simplicity of her presence, but at her eyes, steady and sharp, and in that moment he saw her differently. He realized that while he had been speaking in graphs and markets, she had been seeing through walls, tracing lines no one else wanted to trace, standing in kitchens where the smell of spoiled meat rose behind polished doors. He understood that the cardigan was not a costume of weakness but a shield, that the woman who had poured his wine without flinching had known more than he did about the ground he was standing on. Guest health had been traded for profit under his nose, a scandal waiting to unravel, and it was her hand that had laid the truth before him. He finally looked at Elena Vale not as another executive, not as a figure to persuade, but as someone who had already judged him, someone whose standard was not margin but dignity, and the weight of that gaze made him feel smaller than he had in years. The chandeliers burned softly that evening, their light spilling across linen tables and polished silver, the hum of conversation steady until the moment the staff realized the dining room was not yet open to guests, the doors locked, the tables empty, the air filled only with the quiet shuffle of shoes and the nervous hush of servers gathered together. They stood in clusters, their aprons tied, their eyes flicking toward the figure who stepped forward from the center aisle, the same woman who had carried trays and poured wine, the same cardigan draped across her shoulders, but tonight her presence carried a weight that silenced even the whispers. Elena Vale looked at them with calm eyes, her voice even as she called them to attention, her words falling clear in the wide room where hours earlier laughter and money had ruled. Victor Lowell hovered near the bar, his tie perfect as always, his grin tight but unsteady, a sheen of sweat at his hairline betraying what he already sensed, that the balance of power was shifting. Elena did not look at him first. She looked at the staff, the servers with tired shoes, the bussers with calloused hands, the cooks still smelling faintly of smoke, and she told them plainly that they deserved more than what they had endured, that the numbers told a story of deceit, that the supplier contract signed under Victor's watch had put both their jobs and the health of their guests at risk. She held up a sheet, the false invoices, the crooked records, and her calm voice cut sharper than anger ever could. Then she turned to Victor, her expression steady, her cardigan sleeve brushing against her wrist as she pointed toward the office hallway. She announced, for everyone to hear, that he was fired for cause, his contract void, his actions documented and delivered to the proper authorities. His smile cracked, words spilling about misunderstandings, about loyalty, about her being misled, but his protests fell flat in the heavy silence of the room. Security stepped forward at her quiet nod, and as he was escorted out past the very staff he had mocked and threatened, his gaze darted wildly, searching for sympathy, finding none. Elena faced the room again, and her tone shifted, warmer now, though no less firm. She told them the supplier contract was canceled effective immediately, that no more shipments would arrive under false names, that their kitchens would be supplied only with goods that met the standards promised on every menu. She spoke of ethics not as an idea, but as a foundation, and then she told them something that made the room stir, eyes widening, shoulders lifting. A new program would begin, funded not from the pockets of workers, but from executive bonuses, money redirected to create tuition support for any staff who wished to study further, to create an ethics and welfare fund that would protect them when life struck hard. The silence broke into murmurs, then applause, hesitant at first, then rising, until the sound filled the dining room like thunder. Not the applause of diners impressed by spectacle, but the applause of workers who had been seen at last. Elena stood steady, her cardigan plain, her eyes calm, and in that moment she was not just their employer, she was their shield, and the reckoning had finally come full circle. The dining room had emptied of staff, their voices still echoing faintly in the walls. The applause, a memory that lingered like warmth, long after the sound itself had faded. The chandeliers glowed softer now, dimmed to evening light, and outside the tall windows the city stretched in silver and gold, streets alive with cars, towers burning like lanterns against the night. Cole Harrington stood near the glass, his reflection staring back at him, sharper and smaller than he liked, the city behind him vast enough to make even a man like him feel exposed. He asked quietly if he could have a word, his tone stripped of the bravado he had worn earlier, and Elena, still in her cardigan, stepped forward, her gaze steady, her arms folded loosely as she waited. He cleared his throat, searching for the smooth phrases that usually came without effort, but the silence pressed on him, and for once the words stumbled before they formed. He admitted he had mocked what he did not understand, that he had looked at her sweater, her shoes, the calm way she carried herself on the floor, and assumed weakness, assumed smallness, never realizing she had been holding the entire building together while he was busy performing. His voice was lower than usual, not the polished tone of a pitch, but the raw sound of someone caught without armor. And he confessed that his arrogance had blinded him, that he had laughed at dignity because he had mistaken it for lack of power. Elena said nothing, letting the words sit between them, the city outside glowing like a confession booth, its lights sharp and merciless. Cole pressed on, admitting that his pitch, all the slides and graphs and confident talk, had meant little next to the simple weight of her presence, that she had made him see the hollowness in his own definitions of value. He told her he wanted to invest still, to bring capital to her vision, but not on his terms, only on hers, because he knew now that without her principles, without the safeguards she demanded, the numbers were nothing but fragile glass ready to shatter. He said he would walk away entirely if she wished, that his money would not matter if it compromised what she had built, and for the first time in years he meant it without strategy, without calculation. The silence stretched long, her reflection steady beside his in the window, her face unreadable in the dim light, until she finally spoke, her words even, her tone carrying neither praise nor condemnation. She told him that what mattered was not apology alone but the actions that followed, that capital without conscience was poison, but if he truly understood, if he was willing to tie his fortune to her conditions, then perhaps it could become something more. He nodded, the sharp grin gone, replaced by something quieter, almost humbled, and for once Cole Harrington felt like a student rather than a titan. The city glowed behind them, vast and endless, as though listening, as though bearing witness to a moment that shifted more than a deal, a moment that stripped pride to its core and left only truth. The boardroom lights were lower now, the long table cleared of files except for one final sheet, the contract that had been redrafted under Elena's terms, not Cole's. She sat at the head, her cardigan draped over the chair like a banner of quiet defiance, her hands folded before her gaze steady on the man who had spent his life bending rooms to his will. Cole stood across from her, the city spread behind him in glass and steel, the reflection of a man used to commanding, now waiting, listening. The silence carried the weight of negotiation already won, but not through tricks or leverage, rather through the immovable calm of a woman who had refused to sell dignity for margin. She spoke with clarity, her words precise, not hurried, not softened. There would be 3 non-negotiables, she said, and the room leaned into them as if carved into stone. First, a living wage floor across every branch, not a suggestion or a phased promise, but an immediate line drawn that no staff member could fall beneath. Second, third, party audits of every supply chain, conducted without interference, their findings transparent, their independence absolute, because trust was too fragile to be self-policed. Third, a staff profit pool tied directly to food safety and guest satisfaction. A system where the well-being of both customer and worker was rewarded, where success was measured not only by margins, but by the care taken to protect people. Her tone never rose, yet each condition landed like a verdict, her cardigan sleeve brushing the polished wood as she rested her arm, her voice calm, her presence unwavering. Cole listened, his jaw tight at first, his instinct to argue pressing against the part of him that had lived by control, but then he felt it soften, the resistance fading, because he knew these terms were not traps, not theatrics, they were truths he could no longer deny. He saw in her not a rival pinning him down, but a leader offering him a path to build something larger than numbers, something stronger than the empty disruption he had sold for years. The pen lay before him, sleek and waiting, and when he reached for it, there was no reluctance, no bitterness, only a strange sense of relief, as though signing was not surrender, but release. He scrawled his name across the page, his signature bold, binding him not because he was cornered, but because he was changed. He looked up at her afterward, the sharp grin gone, replaced by something quieter, almost reverent, as though he had glimpsed the measure of value she had asked him about, and finally understood. The board watched, their silence filled with the knowledge that the balance of power in the room had shifted, not through force, but through integrity. Elena folded the signed contract neatly, slipped it into her folder, and rose with the same calm she had carried all along. Cole remained standing a moment longer, his reflection in the glass behind him, smaller now, but truer, as if for the first time the city was showing him who he could become, when respect, not ego, was the measure of worth. The video began without fanfare. No sweeping graphics, no corporate music, just the hum of a dining room caught on hidden cameras, the angle wide enough to see the chandeliers glow and the polished tables below. Staff across the company, from kitchens in distant cities to offices lined with glass, stopped what they were doing as the feed appeared on their screens. At first it seemed ordinary, a night like any other, until a young busser slipped, the crash of a plate shattering the rhythm, silence gripping the room. Then the woman in the cardigan appeared, kneeling without hesitation, steady hands gathering shards, her voice calm as she claimed the blame, shielding the boy from anger that had been ready to fall. The footage lingered on her face, composed, unafraid, dignity rising quiet and strong. The scene shifted, the audio soft but clear, her voice carrying through the room as she explained a truth larger than one mistake. The clip cut to her standing before the staff, cardigan draped on her shoulders, announcing new protections, canceling corrupt contracts, speaking not of margins but of people, her words sharp yet gentle, each phrase marked by conviction. Across branches and offices, workers leaned closer to their screens, some blinking back tears, some exchanging glances filled with disbelief that someone at the top had seen them, had spoken their worth aloud. Then came the final cut. Elena Vale seated in a simple chair, no boardroom backdrop, no glass towers behind her, only the soft glow of a lamp. Her cardigan visible once more, her expression calm. She looked into the camera as if into every pair of eyes watching, and her words landed with quiet weight. "Power isn't what you wear," she said, her voice steady, carrying no polish beyond its sincerity. "It's what you protect." The sentence lingered, simple yet unshakable, and the silence afterward carried more force than any applause could. But the applause came anyway. First in the kitchens, where hands still smelled of garlic and smoke, then in the dining rooms where servers paused between setting tables, then in offices where clerks and managers forgot their formality, the sound spreading across the network like a tide. It rose in waves, Uncoordinated, unpolished, but real. The sound of thousands who had been reminded that dignity was not an idea, but a choice made visible. In one office, Cole Harrington watched the same video, his hands folded loosely, his reflection faint in the glass of the screen. He saw her kneel again to pick up the broken plate, saw her shield the boy with calm words, saw her cardigan against the glow of chandeliers, and he felt the sting of recognition. He had laughed once, mocked what he did not see, mistook her composure for weakness, but now he understood. When the staff applauded, he joined them, not for show, not for performance, but with the quiet clap of someone who knew he had been changed. He felt smaller, wiser, and for the first time in years, somehow more human. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.